the Paul of Acts doesn't look like the Paul of his letters. But it's not hard to understand, because whoever wrote Acts wanted Paul to look like a second version of Peter.
If I'm not mistaken, it was Luke who wrote, Luke, the follower of Paul, who wrote the Acts, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Well, I think you are mistaken.
Oh,
We don't know who wrote Acts, and
no.
I have sincere doubts that it was the historical Luke. But even then,
Mhm.
the guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke, I
Yeah, the
think,
guy who wrote was wrote, yes,
who
yes, the
wrote
same guy.
the guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke did write Acts,
Okay, yeah,
but we have no reason to believe that it was Luke.
I see. Okay.
All of the Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, those names only got attached to the Gospels at the end of the 2nd century, around the year 200.
Mhm.
And so if you go back, you can't figure out who actually wrote them.
I see. Okay.
And one of the reasons that most of us Paul scholars would say that the historical Luke, who may have been a companion of Paul, did not write Luke and Acts, and we would say it's precisely because he doesn't get Paul right.
Because of the differences that you mentioned earlier.
Well, what is Paul most famous for in Christian history? His
Since
letters. His
his
letters.
letters, yeah.
Does
Yeah.
the book of Acts ever mention Paul writing letters?
Not that I recall.
None.
None. Yeah, none. Yeah.
If Paul is like the great apostle
Mhm.
who wrote letters and is most famous for writing letters, why did the writer of Acts not mention it?
Okay.
The writer of Acts also never calls Paul an apostle except once. And it's because the writer of Acts believes that the only person who can be an apostle is someone who was a follower of Jesus during his lifetime.
Yeah, basically Peter and the rest, right?
Yes, he had to be an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry. Well, the writer of Acts knows that Paul was not. So he never calls Paul an apostle except once. And that's when Paul and Barnabas are in Lyra, and the people come out and say the apostle. But that's the only time in all of the book of Acts that Paul is called an apostle.
I see.
And it's not an accident. He didn't believe Paul was an apostle, because Paul was not a disciple of Jesus during his lifetime. And that's stated right at the beginning of Acts, when they have to replace Matthias, who's the one who's killed or dies. Anyway, right at the beginning of Acts, the apostles get together to replace one of the 12, because in Acts, this is not true of the other gospels, but in Acts, the 12 equals the apostles. In the other gospels, you can have, and Paul considered himself an apostle, obviously, but he was not one of the 12. So according to Acts, Paul could not be an apostle because he was not one of the 12.
I see. Interesting.
And when Matthias was appointed as to take over from Judas, when Judas killed himself, the apostles said he has to be someone who's been with Jesus from the beginning, from the baptism of John. Well, Paul was not with Jesus from the baptism of John.
I see.
So he was not an apostle.
See,
I mean,
yeah.
you can produce a million of these things. Like,
Mm, mm,
where does Paul not agree with Acts all the way through?